In the spring of 1829, a tenant farmer working the fields near the Delaware, Maryland border made a discovery that would expose one of America's most chilling criminal enterprises. His plow horse suddenly sank into the ground, revealing a wooden chest buried beneath the soil. Inside were the skeletal remains of what appeared to be a man, his bones yellowed with age and his skull bearing clear signs of violence. This was only the beginning. In the weeks that followed, authorities uncovered the bodies of at least 7 people on the property, including 3 children. All were victims of a woman whose name had already become a whispered terror across the Delmarva Peninsula, Patty Cannon. For nearly 2 decades, Cannon ran what historians now call the Reverse Underground Railroad, a network that kidnapped free African Americans and escaped slaves to sell them back into bondage in the Deep South. But her crimes went beyond human trafficking. Cannon was also a serial killer, murdering rival slave traders, witnesses, and even children whenever they threatened her operations. Court records from Sussex County, Delaware, indicate she was indicted for 4 murders, though witnesses claimed the real number exceeded 20. Before we continue the story of Patty Cannon and her reign of terror along the Mason-Dixon line, I want to know, what state or city are you listening from? Cannon's criminal network reached far beyond Delaware, touching communities from Philadelphia to the Mississippi Delta. Leave a comment to share your location, and don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. These dark chapters of American history must not be forgotten. The discovery of those buried remains ultimately unraveled a criminal conspiracy that had operated with near impunity for over a decade. Aided by jurisdictional confusion, racial prejudice, and the fact that most victims were people whose disappearances went largely unnoticed by white society, the area where Patty Cannon built her empire of terror was particularly suited for crime. In the early 1800s, the region now called Reliance lay at the intersection of 3 jurisdictions: Sussex County in Delaware and Caroline and Dorchester counties in Maryland. This location allowed criminals to step across county and state lines to evade the law. The area was so remote that locals called it Johnson's Crossroads, named after a tavern that would become the headquarters of the most notorious kidnapping ring in American history. The landscape itself seemed designed for concealment. Dense pine and oak forests stretched for miles, interrupted only by marshes and small clearings, where isolated farmsteads dotted the countryside. The Nantoke River wound through the region, providing secret waterways for transporting captives under cover of darkness. Roads were little more than cart paths, and the nearest towns were days away by horseback. For someone operating outside the law, it was ideal. Martha Cannon, known as Patty, arrived in this borderland around 1790. Court records suggest she was born around 1760, possibly under the name Lucretia Patricia Hanley, though she kept her origins vague. Some accounts place her birth in Canada, with immigration to Delaware at age 16. What is documented is her marriage to Jesse Cannon, a local farmer who owned property near the state line. Together, they had at least 1 daughter, and lived what appeared to be an ordinary rural life. Jesse was described by neighbors as quiet and private, working his small farm raising tobacco and corn like many other settlers in the region. The Cannon homestead sat on a modest plot straddling the Delaware, Maryland border, a detail crucial to Patty's later crimes. The house itself was a simple 2-story structure, typical of the period, with thick wooden walls and small windows. What neighbors didn't know was that this ordinary home would contain secret rooms and hidden spaces to conceal kidnapped human beings. Beneath this facade lay something far darker. The early 1800s marked a critical period in American slavery. When Congress banned the importation of enslaved people from Africa in 1808, demand for labor in the expanding cotton fields of Alabama, Mississippi, and Georgia created a lucrative domestic market. A healthy adult slave who had cost $300 before the ban now sold for over $100,000 in the Deep South. This price surge incentivized criminals willing to traffic in human misery. The South's economic transformation after the invention of the cotton gin fueled an insatiable demand for enslaved labor. Cotton production expanded rapidly across the Gulf Coast states, and planters were willing to pay premium prices for workers. The legal ban on importing enslaved people meant The only source of new labor was the domestic population, either through natural increase or through the capture and enslavement of free African Americans. The Delmarva Peninsula was especially vulnerable. After the Revolutionary War, many enslaved people had been freed through gradual emancipation laws or individual acts of manumission. Maryland and Delaware had substantial populations of free African Americans working as laborers, artisans, and small farmers. These communities, though legally free, lived in constant fear. They had limited legal protection, little recourse, and disappearances often went unreported or ignored by white authorities who viewed them as less than fully human. The legal status of free African Americans in the early 1800s was precarious at best. Though not enslaved, they had few of the rights enjoyed by white citizens. They could not vote, serve on juries, or testify against white defendants in most courts. Their freedom could be challenged at any time, and they were required to carry papers proving their status. For criminals like Patty Cannon, these legal vulnerabilities created opportunities for exploitation. Into this environment stepped Patty Cannon, a woman who would prove that evil knows no gender boundaries. Contemporary accounts describe her as large and physically imposing, possessing unusual strength for her gender. She stood nearly 6 feet tall in an era when most women barely reached 5, and neighbors described her presence as intimidating. Her voice was reportedly deep and commanding, and she had a reputation for violent outbursts when crossed. Her husband, Jesse, died under mysterious circumstances around 1826, with some later claiming she poisoned him, leaving her a widow in full control of the family property. By that time, she had already begun forming the criminal connections that would make her name synonymous with terror. Local law enforcement was virtually non-existent in the rural border region, and what little authority existed was often corrupt or overwhelmed by the scale of criminal activity. The social dynamics of the region also favored crime. The white population was sparse and transient, largely composed of small farmers, laborers, and people seeking to escape their pasts. There was little sense of community cohesion, and neighbors often minded their own business, regardless of what they suspected about one another. This isolation and indifference would prove crucial to Cannon's ability to operate undetected for years. Patty Cannon's transformation from frontier widow to criminal mastermind began with her daughters' marriages, which would shape the next 2 decades. Both daughters married men involved in slave kidnapping. Her first son-in-law, Henry Breton, was a blacksmith who supplemented his income by capturing free African Americans for sale in the South. In 1811, Breton was arrested and imprisoned in Georgetown, Delaware, for kidnapping but escaped the same year. His criminal activities had been well known in the local community long before his arrest. As a blacksmith, Breton traveled throughout the region, visiting farms and settlements to shoe horses and repair tools, a mobility that provided perfect cover for his illegal activities. He would identify potential victims during these legitimate visits, noting which families had teenage children or young adults who could fetch high prices in southern slave markets. Early kidnappers like Breton relied on crude but effective methods: deception, overwhelming force, and the isolation of rural life. A common tactic involved offering employment in distant locations to free African American families. Parents, desperate for economic opportunities for their children, would sometimes allow them to travel with these supposed employers, only to discover too late that they had unknowingly signed their children's death warrants. After Breton's escape, the first documented murder connected to the Cannon family occurred. Breton, working with Patty Cannon and another criminal, Joseph Griffith, ambushed a slave trader known as Rigidal at Cannon's Tavern. Their plan was simple but brutal: get the victim drunk, steal his money and slaves, and eliminate the witness. Court records show Rigidal was shot and killed during the robbery. Breton and Griffith were eventually captured and hanged on April 13, 1813, but Patty Cannon escaped prosecution. The Rigidal murder marked a significant escalation in the criminal activity centered around the Cannon property. Before this, the family had mainly facilitated kidnappings and provided safe haven for criminals passing through the region. Committing murder for profit demonstrated a level of ruthlessness that would define all of Cannon's future activities. Contemporary newspapers provide disturbing details about the Rigidal case. The victim was traveling with a substantial sum of money, estimated between $3,000 and $5,000, intended for purchasing enslaved people in local markets. He stopped at what he believed was a legitimate tavern for food and lodging, unaware it was a trap. The conspirators plied him with alcohol throughout the evening, waiting for the right moment to strike. When Rigidal retired to his room, Breton and Griffith followed him. Neighbors later reported shouting and the sounds of a struggle, followed by a gunshot. By morning, Rigidal was dead, his money gone, and his wagon and horses disappeared. His body was hastily buried on the property, beginning a pattern of using the isolated location as a dumping ground for murder victims. The execution of her daughter's first husband did nothing to deter Cannon from her path. Instead, it seemed to refine her methods and strengthen her resolve to build a more sophisticated criminal organization. The lesson she drew from Breton's capture was not that crime didn't pay, but that criminals needed better organization and careful planning to avoid detection. When her daughter remarried, this time to Joseph Johnson, Cannon gained a partner who would prove even more valuable to her criminal enterprise. Johnson was not merely another kidnapper. He was a businessman who understood the logistics of human trafficking on a regional scale. He had connections throughout the South, experience in transportation and logistics, and, crucially, the capital to expand their operations beyond opportunistic crimes. Johnson brought with him a tavern located directly on the Delaware, Maryland state line. Known as Joe Johnson's Tavern, it was strategically positioned so that different rooms sat in different states. This geographic advantage allowed them to move kidnapped victims between jurisdictions, confusing pursuing authorities. When Delaware lawmen arrived with warrants, suspects could simply step into the Maryland portion of the building and claim immunity from Delaware jurisdiction. The tavern served multiple purposes. It operated as a legitimate business, providing cover for their activities, generating income, and explaining the constant flow of travelers and wagons. It also functioned as a holding facility for captives awaiting transport south, with specially constructed hidden rooms and cellars designed to conceal human cargo. Additionally, it served as a meeting place for their network of criminals, a neutral ground where plans were made and profits divided. The physical layout of the tavern reflected these multiple functions. The main floor appeared ordinary, with a common room for travelers, a bar, and rooms for legitimate guests. Beneath the building lay a series of cellars and tunnels specially constructed for hiding kidnapped people. These underground spaces were accessible through concealed entrances, designed to muffle sound and prevent escape. Iron rings set into stone walls provided anchor points for chains, while small ventilation shafts ensured captives would not suffocate during long confinement. The gang surrounding Cannon and Johnson was remarkably diverse for its time. It included white criminals like Henry Carr, mixed race operatives such as John Purnell, who used multiple aliases, and even enslaved people forced to participate in capturing others. This multi-racial composition was strategic. American members could approach potential victims without raising immediate suspicion, while white members handled negotiations with buyers in the Deep South. John Purnell, described in court records as a yellow man or mulatto, was particularly valuable. His mixed heritage allowed him to move between white and African American communities with relative ease. Purnell maintained multiple identities, presenting himself either as a free person of color seeking work or a light-skinned white man conducting business, depending on the situation. This chameleon-like ability made him an ideal scout for identifying potential victims and establishing initial contact. By the 1820s, the scope of the Cannon-Johnson operation had expanded dramatically. Their network stretched from Pennsylvania to Louisiana, with documented connections to buyers in Alabama, Mississippi, and Georgia. Joseph Watson, the Quaker mayor of Philadelphia, began tracking the disappearances of citizens from his city and tracing them back to the Delmarva Peninsula. His investigations revealed the horrifying scale of the operation. In 1825 alone, Watson documented dozens of kidnappings connected to the Cannon gang. The victims were not random targets. They were often specifically chosen for vulnerability. Young adults brought the highest prices in southern markets, but children were also valuable. Able to be trained for tasks and providing decades of labor, the systematic nature of these kidnappings demonstrated organization far beyond opportunistic crime. The gang maintained detailed intelligence on potential targets, tracking families and individuals who might be vulnerable. They knew which young people had recently lost their jobs, which families were struggling financially, and which individuals might be tempted by offers of employment in distant locations. One of the most detailed accounts comes from Lydia Smith, a 25-year-old free woman kidnapped in 1825. Court records preserve her testimony. She was first held in Cannon's house, then moved to Johnson's Tavern, where she remained chained for 5 months. Smith recalled constant fear, inadequate food, and the knowledge that she was scheduled to be transported south with a large group of other kidnapped people. Her eventual rescue by Watson's network saved her from a lifetime of bondage. Smith's account provides crucial insight into the conditions endured by the gang's victims. She was seized while walking alone near Philadelphia, overpowered by multiple attackers, and transported by wagon to the Delaware, Maryland border. The journey took several days, during which she was blindfolded and chained to prevent escape. Upon arrival at the Cannon property, she was placed in a hidden room beneath the main house, where she discovered she was not alone. According to Smith, the underground holding areas contained dozens of other kidnapped people at various times. Men, women, and children were kept in separate areas, all chained to prevent escape. Conditions were deliberately harsh: inadequate food, no sanitation, and constant darkness, except when guards brought candles during feeding times. The psychological torment was as severe as the physical. As captives understood, they were destined for sale into lifelong bondage. Smith also described the gang's methods for processing their human cargo. Victims were systematically stripped of any papers, proving their free status, and personal belongings that might identify them were destroyed. They were given new names and false backgrounds to support their sale as slaves. Those who resisted or tried to maintain their true identities were beaten until they complied. The gang's operations were an open secret in the local community. Neighbors noticed people disappearing near the Cannon property, wagons arriving at odd hours, and suspicious gatherings at Johnson's Tavern. But the victims were African Americans in a society where their word carried little weight against white criminals. Local law enforcement, when it existed, showed little interest in investigating crimes against people they viewed as inherently suspect. The complicity of the local white community went beyond indifference. Some neighbors actively supported the gang, either by participating directly or providing information about potential victims. Merchants supplied provisions without questioning the source of payment. Even some law enforcement officials were suspected of accepting bribes to ignore suspicious activity. This indifference changed only when white victims became involved. The gang did not just kidnap free African Americans, they also robbed and murdered slave traders carrying large sums of cash. These victims were white men engaged in the legal slave trade, and their disappearances attracted attention that African American victims never received. The first documented case occurred around 1820, when a slave trader from Georgia, referred to as Bell or Miller, vanished while traveling through the area. He carried a substantial sum, reportedly or 35 zars, intended for purchasing enslaved people. Last seen at Cannon's establishment, his horse was later found in her possession. Cannon claimed he had sailed south with enslaved people, but investigators found this implausible. This disappearance marked the beginning of a pattern that would eventually lead to the gang's downfall. Unlike African American victims, missing white traders had business partners and financial backers demanding investigations. Their planned itineraries and substantial funds made their disappearances difficult to ignore. Cannon's method for dealing with these victims was typically brutal. Traders were invited to the tavern under the pretense of legitimate business. Once there, they were plied with alcohol and encouraged to reveal their financial resources and travel plans. When the opportunity arose, they were murdered and robbed, their bodies buried on the property, and their money and enslaved people incorporated into the gang's operations. The profits were substantial, A single trader might carry enough money to fund the gang's operations for months, and the enslaved people they transported could be sold through southern networks, generating further income. Eliminating competitors also helped the gang maintain a monopoly on criminal activity in the region. By the mid-1820s, pressure on the Cannon, Johnson gang was mounting. Mayor Joseph Watson of Philadelphia offered substantial rewards for information, leading to arrests, and Pennsylvania Governor John Andrew Schulzer coordinated with officials in southern states to track kidnapped citizens. Their investigations revealed not only individual crimes, but a systematic network that had operated for over a decade. The $500 reward offered by Watson, a significant sum at the time, equivalent to several months' wages, began to loosen tongues. Former associates, dissatisfied gang members, and even escaped victims started providing information to authorities. The gang's response was characteristically violent. Rather than curbing their activities, they began eliminating potential witnesses more aggressively. This decision would ultimately contribute to their downfall, as it expanded the list of victims to include people whose disappearances could not be ignored. The escalation in violence reflected Patty Cannon's increasingly paranoid mindset. She had built a criminal empire that generated enormous profits, with annual earnings estimated at over 50 $50,000, a fortune in the early 19th century. But her success made her a target for law enforcement, and she became convinced that former associates posed an existential threat to her operations. The most crucial figure in the gang's eventual exposure was a mixed-race boy named Cyrus James. Cannon had purchased him as a slave when he was only 7 years old and raised him in her household. As he grew older, Cyrus James was forced to participate in the gang's activities, serving as a decoy to lure other African Americans into traps. His intimate knowledge of the gang's operations, combined with his growing revulsion at the violence he witnessed, made him both an invaluable asset and a potential liability. James's position in the Cannon household was tragically complex. As an enslaved child, he had no choice but to participate in whatever activities his owner demanded. As he matured, however, he began to grasp the full horror of his role. He was helping to destroy the lives of people who looked like him, shared his heritage, and were equally vulnerable. This awareness created an internal conflict that would eventually lead him to cooperate with authorities, despite the personal risks. The psychological manipulation Cannon employed to control James was both sophisticated and cruel. She alternated between treating him as a favored member of the household and threatening him with violence or sale to brutal masters in the Deep South. She convinced him that his survival depended entirely on her protection, and that any betrayal would result in his immediate death. This combination of dependency and terror kept James loyal for years, even as he witnessed increasingly horrific crimes. James later testified that he had seen Cannon murder multiple children on her property. In one particularly harrowing account, he described seeing Cannon take a wounded African American child, not yet dead, in her apron, never to return. James knew the locations of these graves because he had been forced to help dispose of the bodies. These murders were calculated based on Cannon's assessment of risk and profit. Children who became sick or injured were killed rather than treated, as medical care would have been expensive and drawn attention. Young people who resisted or insisted on their free status were eliminated as potential problems. Even infants born to kidnapped women were sometimes killed if Cannon deemed them more trouble than they were worth. The gang's undoing began with their treatment of rival slave traders. Competition in the illegal human trafficking trade was fierce, and Cannon's gang developed a reputation for murdering competitors to seize their money and human cargo. This practice accelerated as law enforcement pressure increased. Dead slave traders could not testify about their interactions with the gang. Escalating violence against white victims reflected both Cannon's growing desperation and a fundamental miscalculation. She had operated with impunity for so long that she assumed the same would hold true for white victims. This assumption would prove fatal. In early 1829, bodies began to surface. A tenant farmer plowing land owned by Cannon stumbled upon a grave. His horse sank into the ground in a recently cleared low-lying area, revealing a wooden chest containing human bones. Authorities identified the remains as those of the missing Georgia slave trader from nearly a decade earlier. This discovery triggered a systematic search of the property, uncovering multiple burial sites. The farmer had been working land that Cannon rented out for extra income. The area had previously been avoided due to flooding, but recent dry weather made it suitable for cultivation. When the plow horse sank, he initially assumed it was a natural depression or old well. It was only when he began digging to free the horse that he realized the true horror. The wooden chest, remarkably well preserved, suggested it had been buried relatively recently, despite the decade-old remains. It appeared specifically constructed to conceal a human body, indicating a systematic approach to disposal refined over years. The discovery of this first body set in motion events that would bring Cannon's criminal empire to an end. Delaware authorities, working with Maryland counterparts, obtained search warrants and began a comprehensive investigation of all properties connected to the Cannon-Johnson gang. The investigation was led by Sheriff Joseph Houston of Sussex County, Delaware, in coordination with Maryland authorities and representatives from the Pennsylvania governor's office. This multi-jurisdictional effort was unprecedented for the period, reflecting recognition that the gang's activities crossed state lines and required coordinated enforcement. The warrants obtained allowed authorities to excavate any areas of Cannon properties where bodies might be concealed. This legal authority was crucial, protecting investigators from accusations of trespassing or illegal search and seizure. The warrants also specified that any evidence discovered could be used in prosecutions across multiple jurisdictions, closing the legal loopholes the gang had exploited for years. On April 3, 1829, Cyrus James was captured in Delaware. The circumstances of his arrest remain somewhat unclear, but court records indicate he was attempting to flee the region when apprehended. Faced with overwhelming evidence and the prospect of execution, James, the young man forced into a life of crime as a child, made a fateful decision. He would cooperate with authorities and reveal everything he knew about Paddy Cannon's operations. This choice was not made lightly. James understood that his testimony could lead to his own prosecution for crimes he had been compelled to commit, but he also realized that continued silence meant protecting the woman who had enslaved him and forced him to destroy countless lives. His cooperation was both a legal strategy and a moral choice, breaking free from Cannon's psychological control for the first time. James's testimony was devastating. Speaking to the justice of the peace in Seaford, Delaware, he provided detailed accounts of murders spanning nearly a decade. He recounted how Joseph Johnson, his brother Ebenezer Johnson, and Paddy Cannon had shot the Georgia slave trader while he was eating supper at Cannon's house, then carried the body to a wooden chest and buried it on the property. This was only the beginning of his revelations. The level of detail in James's testimony gave investigators their first comprehensive understanding of the gang's operations. He could describe not only individual crimes, but also the systematic methods employed by the gang over many years. He knew burial locations, the identities of other gang members, the routes used to transport kidnapped individuals, and the networks of buyers and sellers stretching across multiple states. Following James's directions, authorities began excavating the Cannon property. In a garden area, they discovered the body of a young mixed-race child. According to James, the child had been enslaved along with his mother. Cannon had killed the child because she suspected the father was white, possibly even a member of her own family. The fate of the mother remains unknown, leaving the horrifying possibility that she too was murdered. This discovery revealed the extent of Cannon's callousness. This was not a rival or kidnapped victim, but a child born into her household, killed purely out of racist paranoia and fear that a mixed-race child might threaten her operations. Additional excavations uncovered 2 wooden boxes containing human bones. James identified one set as belonging to another child he had seen Cannon beat to death. The third set belonged to an adult whom the gang believed owned property, marking them as a free person with resources worth seizing. The systematic nature of these murders painted Cannon as more than a criminal. She was a serial killer operating with impunity. Shielded by her remote location, local authorities' indifference to crimes against African Americans, and a network of co-conspirators sharing in her profits. The physical evidence corroborated James's testimony in remarkable detail. The wooden boxes were similarly constructed, suggesting they were specifically made to conceal bodies. Grave locations followed a deliberate pattern, indicating systematic planning rather than random burial. Most disturbing, the condition of some remains suggested victims had been buried alive. As news of the discoveries spread, other witnesses began coming forward. People who had lived in fear of Cannon for years suddenly found the courage to speak, revealing additional victims and corroborating James's account. Among them was Thomas Freeman, a free African-American who had been approached by gang members in 1827 but managed to escape. Freeman testified that he had been offered work in Georgia and was traveling toward Cannon's property when he became suspicious. He slipped away during a rest stop and spent several days hiding in the woods before returning to Philadelphia. Freeman's testimony was crucial in understanding the gang's recruitment methods. The initial approach had seemed legitimate. He struggling to find work. He had been offered a position on a Georgia plantation with generous wages and free transportation. Only during the journey did he notice inconsistencies in his escort's stories. Realizing their true intentions, the investigation's scope quickly expanded beyond Delaware. Authorities in Maryland began examining properties owned by gang members, while officials in Pennsylvania coordinated efforts to document the full scope of the kidnapping network. The horrors in Sussex County were far from over. The coordination between jurisdictions represented a new approach to law enforcement that would later become standard practice. For the first time, authorities treated the Cannon Gang as what it truly was, an interstate criminal conspiracy requiring a federal-level response. This recognition led to the involvement of officials from Washington, D.C., marking the beginning of coordinated federal efforts against organized crime. On April 13, 1829, a grand jury of 24 white men in Delaware handed down indictments against Martha Patty Cannon on 4 counts of murder. Signed by Delaware Attorney General James Rogers, these charges marked the first serious legal consequences for any member of the notorious gang. The grand jury itself was notable. Composed entirely of white males, as required by law, it represented a cross-section of the state's population, including farmers, merchants, and professionals. Their willingness to indict a white woman for the murder of African Americans reflected a shift in legal attitudes, driven by overwhelming evidence and the interstate nature of Cannon's crimes. The indictments were remarkably specific. Cannon was charged with murdering an infant female on April 26, 1822, a male child on the same date, an adult male on October 1, 1820, and a boy on June 3, 1824. Each charge carried the death penalty, supported by an extraordinary body of evidence. Unlike many criminal cases of the period, which relied mainly on witness testimony and circumstantial evidence, the Cannon case was built on physical evidence, multiple corroborating witnesses, and detailed confessions from a participant with intimate knowledge of the crimes. This combination made the case nearly impossible to defend. Cyrus James's testimony formed the backbone of the prosecution. His detailed knowledge of the gang's operations and his ability to lead authorities to burial sites made him the most valuable witness in Delaware's legal history to that point. The young man forced into crime as a child now held the power to bring justice to the woman who had terrorized the region for decades. Attorney General James Rogers led the prosecution, bringing his experience with complex criminal cases to bear. He recognized that the Cannon case presented an opportunity to demonstrate that the law applied equally to all citizens, regardless of race or social status, and that a successful prosecution would send a strong message to other criminal enterprises in the region. Patty Cannon herself was a figure who defied easy categorization, even to her contemporaries. Newspaper accounts described her as a large, physically powerful woman who commanded fear and respect, even from hardened criminals. At approximately 70 years old, she remained sharp-minded and defiant, showing no remorse even when confronted with irrefutable evidence. Contemporary descriptions of Cannon during her imprisonment depict an unrepentant criminal, genuinely bewildered by the legal proceedings. She apparently viewed her actions as legitimate business and could not understand why authorities prosecuted her for crimes against people she considered property. rather than human beings. Her imprisonment in the Sussex County Jail in Georgetown, Delaware, reflected the seriousness of her crimes and the unusual circumstance of a female defendant facing multiple murder charges. Cannon was kept under constant guard due to fears of escape or retaliation by surviving gang members. The Georgetown Jail, a crude stone structure built in the early 1800s to house petty criminals and debtors, was not designed for dangerous felons facing capital charges. Authorities reinforced her cell with additional iron bars and locks and posted extra guards to ensure her detention. During confinement, Cannon began speaking more freely about her criminal career. According to contemporary accounts, she admitted to killing at least 24 people over the course of her career. These victims included not only the African Americans buried on her property, but also rival slave traders, potential witnesses, and anyone posing a threat to her operations. The most chilling aspect of Cannon's confessions was her matter-of-fact tone. She discussed murder as a business necessity, describing the killings of children and adults with the same casual indifference she might use when discussing livestock. Her apparent lack of moral conscience shocked even hardened law enforcement officials accustomed to frontier violence. Cannon's confessions provided authorities with details about crimes far beyond the charges for which she had been indicted. She described murders dating back to the early 1810s, kidnappings involving hundreds of victims, and a criminal network that stretched across multiple states. These revelations confirmed investigators' suspicions that the crimes discovered on her property represented only a fraction of the gang's total activities. The legal proceedings moved forward with unusual speed for the period. Overwhelming evidence and intense public pressure for justice created momentum for a quick trial. Court records indicate that Cannon was expected to face trial within weeks of her indictment, with execution to follow shortly thereafter if convicted. The prosecution strategy was straightforward: present the physical evidence, provide testimony from Cyrus James and other witnesses, and allow the jury to reach the inevitable conclusion of guilt. The defense, limited as it was, could only argue for mercy based on Cannon's age and gender, though few believed such appeals would succeed given the horrific nature of her crimes. The trial was scheduled to begin in late May 1829, with jury selection planned for the preceding week. Legal observers from across the region were expected to attend, as the case represented one of Delaware's most significant criminal prosecutions. Newspapers as far away as Philadelphia and Baltimore prepared extensive coverage, but the proceedings would never reach their intended conclusion. On May 11, 1829, roughly 3 weeks before her scheduled execution, jail guards discovered Cannon dead in her cell. The official cause of death was listed as suicide by poison, though the exact circumstances remain unclear. Some accounts suggest she had been smuggled arsenic by sympathizers. Others propose she had been hoarding medication for weeks. The discovery of Cannon's body sent shockwaves through Georgetown Jail and the wider community. Guards found her lying on the floor of her cell, apparently having died during the night. There were no signs of struggle, and the cell remained securely locked. A small vial hidden in her clothing contained arsenic, though investigators never determined exactly how she had obtained it. Visitors were not thoroughly searched before meeting prisoners, making it possible that a sympathizer had smuggled the poison, though no source was ever identified. Some contemporaries speculated that Cannon had planned her suicide from the moment of her arrest. Having witnessed the execution of her daughter's first husband, she understood the fate that awaited her if convicted. Rather than face public execution, she chose to die on her own terms, maintaining control over her fate until the end. Her death deprived victims' families of the satisfaction of seeing justice served, but brought it close to one of the most systematic criminal enterprises in early American history. Court records confirm that Cannon's death effectively ended the reverse Underground Railroad that had operated along the Delmarva Peninsula for nearly 2 decades. The immediate aftermath was chaotic. Authorities had been preparing for what would have been the most significant criminal trial in Delaware history, and her suicide left many questions unanswered about the full extent of her network. Investigations continued for months, but without Cannon's testimony, many details of the gang's operations remained unclear. The fates of her surviving co-conspirators varied. Joseph Johnson, her son-in-law and primary partner, fled to Alabama or Mississippi before investigations began. His brother Ebenezer escaped to the Deep South, presumably continuing criminal activities beyond Delaware authorities' reach. Local law enforcement made half-hearted attempts to pursue them, but jurisdictional complications and vast distances made prosecution unlikely. Only Cyrus James, the enslaved boy forced into the gang's crimes, remained to face justice. Because of his cooperation and coerced involvement, Delaware courts granted him freedom and protection from retaliation. He was relocated to Pennsylvania, where abolitionists helped him establish a new identity and start a legitimate life. Some accounts suggest he later became active in the Underground Railroad, using his knowledge of criminal networks to assist escaped slaves. Investigations revealed that the Cannon-Johnson gang had kidnapped hundreds of free African Americans over the course of their operations, leaving a legacy of terror and suffering that would not be forgotten. While exact numbers remain disputed, conservative estimates suggest that Patty Cannon and her gang trafficked between 500 and 1,000 people into slavery in the Deep South. The economic value of these crimes, measured by the prices enslaved people commanded in southern markets, would equate to millions of dollars in today's currency. Yet the human cost extended far beyond numbers. Each kidnapping destroyed families, stole lives, and reinforced a system that treated human beings as property. Many victims were never recovered, spending the rest of their lives in bondage far from home. Children were torn from parents, spouses separated, and entire communities lived in constant fear of similar attacks. The geographic reach of the gang's operations was staggering. Evidence gathered during investigations revealed connections stretching from New York to Louisiana. The Cannon gang was part of a broader network of illegal human trafficking that exploited jurisdictional confusion and the limited law enforcement capabilities of the early 19th century. Patty Cannon's body was initially buried in the graveyard of the Georgetown jail where she died, in an unceremonious interment that reflected the community's desire to forget her horrors. When the land was later developed into a parking lot in the 20th century, her remains were moved to a potter's field near the new prison. In a macabre twist, her skull was separated from the rest of her remains and displayed in various venues over the years. As late as 1961, it was on loan to the Dover Public Library, serving as a grim reminder of one of Delaware's darkest chapters. This treatment, disturbing by modern standards, reflected the public's fascination with her crimes and their lingering horror. The legacy of Patty Cannon extends far beyond her individual acts. Her story illustrates the systematic violence underpinning American slavery, the vulnerability of free African Americans in the antebellum period, and the ways sophisticated criminals exploited geographic and legal loopholes. The reverse Underground Railroad she ran stood as a dark mirror to the networks, helping enslaved people escape to freedom, a reminder that for every story of liberation, countless others ended in re-enslavement and death. Modern historians study the Cannon case as an example of how criminal enterprises could thrive in gaps between legal jurisdictions. Her ability to operate undetected for nearly 2 decades demonstrates how racism, legal limitations, and economic incentives allowed such horrors to persist. The case also highlighted the weaknesses of early 19th century law enforcement: lack of coordination across jurisdictions, the absence of professional police forces, and limited communication all contributed to the gang's impunity. These lessons later informed efforts to develop more effective strategies for tackling interstate crime. The impact on the local community was profound and enduring. The area around Johnson's Crossroads never fully recovered from its association with the Cannon gang. Its name was eventually changed to Reliance to escape the infamy, yet the stigma persisted for generations. Property values remained depressed, and many families chose to relocate rather than remain in a place linked to such horrors. The case also had broader societal implications. Authorities' willingness to prosecute Cannon, even though most victims were African American, marked a small but notable shift in legal attitudes, recognizing that all people, regardless of race, deserved protection under the law. Documentation of her crimes also fueled the abolitionist movement, providing stark evidence of how easily free African Americans could be forced into slavery and highlighting the inherent dangers of the system itself. In the decades following Cannon's death, her story became part of regional folklore, often distorted or sensationalized. Numerous books, pamphlets, and newspaper articles recounted her crimes, blending fact with fiction. The most famous example was George Alfred Townsend's 1884 novel, The Untailed Hat, which dramatized Cannon's story into a tale of frontier crime. The original Cannon House remained a site of morbid fascination for decades. Visitors traveled to the remote location to see where her crimes had occurred, and locals developed a cottage industry, offering tours and souvenirs. Though the house was finally demolished in 1948, the site continued to draw curiosity seekers well into the modern era. Patty Cannon's story remains a stark reminder of how society can turn a blind eye to systematic violence when victims are dehumanized, and how greed, prejudice, and lawlessness can allow unspeakable horrors to persist unchecked. The indifference that allowed Patty Cannon to operate for decades was only broken when her crimes began to target white victims, whose disappearances could not be ignored. The very legal system that had failed to protect free African Americans from kidnapping and murder finally acted, but only when Cannon threatened the property and financial interests of white slave traders. The Cannon case stands as a chilling reminder of humanity's capacity for evil and the critical need for vigilant law enforcement and community accountability. It shows how criminal enterprises can thrive in environments where society neglects its most vulnerable members. Most importantly, it preserves the memory of hundreds of largely forgotten victims, whose suffering should never be minimized or overlooked. Do you think the full scope of her criminal network was ever revealed? Evidence suggests that Cannon's gang was part of a much larger system of illegal human trafficking that extended far beyond the Delaware, Maryland border. Many questions remain about the extent of their operations and the fates of their victims. Share your thoughts on this dark chapter of American history in the comments below. If this story captivated you and you want more tales from America's hidden past, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share with someone who loves uncovering forgotten mysteries. Join us next time as we explore another terrifying, true story from the shadows of American history.